Okay, so this is what we'll be talking about this evening. Growth of smuggling throughout the 18th century, the particular impact of it on the Napoleonic Wars, and resurgence and decline. And because what I do want to get over here is the fact that smuggling actually doesn't stop in 1815. It goes on with equal intensity right through into the 1840s. And we'll be looking at the reason why it actually declines in the 1840s. One of the things I want to get over tonight is I want you to suspend from your mind what we believe about smuggling. You know, we've got this confounded poem by Rudyard Kipling, you know, 4 and 20 ponies trotting through the dark, brandy for the parson, baccy for the clerk. And they refer to them as the free traders. Watch the wall, my darling, as the gentlemen walk by. And you may remember we've got Moonfleet as well. We've got, God help us, Poldark, and this view that the smugglers are gentlemen. In a way, you know, what's the problem of defrauding the revenue of a little bit of tax when it helps the poor? The real truth about smuggling in the 18th and 19th century is we are talking about a very bloody and violent business, and we are talking about organised crime on a massive scale. It's not like the old days when, you know, you put into your suitcase an actual bottle of wine, knowing full well that took you over the duty-free allocation. This is not what we are talking about here. What's the scope of it? This is a document in 1783. It's circulated, as you can see, through both houses of Parliament, dealing with the issues of smuggling. And I just want to pick up a couple of points, if I may. You'll see, I mean, the document is quite large, but the key points coming out are this isn't just applying to the coasts. It's also applying to every city, town, and village in England, because the goods actually end up in every city, town, and village in England. It employs a lot of people, not just people who are smugglers, not just people who are taking the goods when they've landed on the coast, but people who distribute them. And we now know a lot about the market circulating in London, where goods are actually brought by quite a complex mechanism and then traded and then sunk into London and other large towns and cities where it's virtually impossible to track down a smuggled good. You can see here the quantities that are actually being smuggled here. 4 million gallons of gin, 80 to 90% of the import of tea. Projected loss to the revenue, 3 million. That might not sound much, but the revenue is much smaller in those days. The income of the government is much smaller, and already calculating 3 million in these days now 300 million, but it's a much higher proportion. The government revenue, the government budget is only 5% of GDP at this time. And the most important thing about this document is this line: the smugglers are a very powerful body. And we're going to actually uncover some household names here about who are the people pulling the strings, particularly in the southeast. So one of the things I want to say is smuggling is happening everywhere. And there are books now covering every single coast part of the coastline in England, Wales, the Isle of Man, Scotland, Ireland, indeed New England and New Brunswick as well, telling stories of smuggling. People will import gin in from the Netherlands, and their boats will be seen in the Solway Firth in Cumberland. They will be seen off the coast of Aberdeen. Smuggling is happening all the way around the British coastline during this period. First example of smuggling, well, this is interesting. The first person accused of smuggling owns this island. This is Peel Castle, and it's in the south of Cumbria. It is owned by the Abbey of Furness, the wealthiest religious monastery in the northwest of England. It's Cistercian, and if you've been to Cumbria, you know that in medieval times, all the sheep in Cumbria are owned either by the Abbot of Furness or the Abbot of Fountains in Yorkshire. In 1423, the Abbot Robert of Furness is accused of smuggling. What's he doing? Well, it's wool smuggling. And basically what's happened is over a period of time, if you're wanting to actually export wool to the continent, you've got to go through the staple at Calais and pay a tax. Abbot Robert, bless him, has discovered a way of actually circumnavigating this. He ignores Calais, and because he's got a castle and he's got a harbour and he's got the abbot and he's abbot of Furness, he sends all the wool from this Cistercian abbey directly to his purchasers in actually Zealand, in Holland. And therefore doesn't pay tax and undercuts his competitors. Now, you would have thought this was absolutely awful. It's a religious man, etc., etc., etc. Therefore, he'll be penalised. Don't believe it. He gets a promotion in the Cistercian order, and 15 years later, his successor is doing exactly the same. Why? Because there's money in doing so. These are the key pieces of legislation as regards smuggling. The first is a tax on wool and woolen products put in by Edward I. In the 1580s, guns have actually been smuggled out of the forest of Dean via Bristol. And those guns are going to Spain and to the Spanish possessions in northern Italy. It means that when Francis Drake et al. Take on the Spanish Armada, English guns are on Spanish Armada ships. In 1643, as part of a revenue generating issue, excise is set up. Now, this is originally a tax on goods produced in the UK, but the excise officers are responsible for levying a tax on goods in customs warehouses. In 1661, we get the first reference in the English language to actual smuggling, and they're called smugglers, the sort of lewd people never heard before the late disordered times. In 1698, the government established riding officers to patrol the coasts. In 1718, the first Hovering Act is actually passed, and this is actually designed to allow the government of revenue ships and the Royal Navy ships to seize any boat hovering spending a particular period of time off the coast, but never coming actually into harbour. And of course, what's happening here is people are coming over with the goods, staying put offshore, smaller boats coming in, picking up those goods. You can see how the Acts of Parliament start getting more frequent here as the government tries to actually cope with this problem of smuggling. The biggest humdinger is 1745. And smuggling is now a felony punishable alone by hanging. And this one act actually then causes the violence of smuggling to actually grow. And because what's happening, if you're a smuggler and you're caught by a revenue officer, you're going to be hung. So therefore, if you pull out a gun and shoot the revenue officer and get away, the chances are you're not going to be caught. Therefore, it's worth killing revenue officers. And so this is a reason why this all becomes much more violent, as we will see. What's the importance? And I think this is something that we've never really got to grips with. And the reason we've not got to grips with it is the fact we haven't really, as historians, looked at the problems the British government has on revenue. The only revenue that the government has to pay, and remember, income tax isn't founded until 1799, is the fact it can draw on poor law tax, but that goes into the poor law. There's a coal tax, which actually is taxed on coal coming into London. There's a land tax, which starts in 1692, a windows tax in 1696, but 2/3, sometimes 70% of all government income is customs and excise. And therefore, anything that stops that tax being collected causes a problem for the British government, particularly as empire grows. And of course, this will lead into the situation of America, where we get to say to the American colonies, okay, pay for your army, and we then get no taxation without representation, and we all know where that ends up. Also, there's an impact on slavery as well, because a lot of the tax that is levied on sugar, that goes into government coffers. And therefore anything that is going to cause an impact on the West Indies is viewed with great caution by the government. So anytime anybody comes up with an idea of let's stop the slave trade or let's stop slavery, that causes great concern amongst government, as in what's going to happen to the actual revenue. The other thing about customs and excise is it's indiscriminate as a tax. Everybody pays the same. Whereas if you've got a window tax, the people with the largest houses with most windows pay more. The land tax is on the property holders. As we all know, the property holders are sat in this thing called the House of Commons and the House of Lords. It is begging belief that they are going to agree to take a bigger hit on them rather than something which applies across the board, regardless of how poor you are. And so the landed property class refused to allow an increase in window tax and land tax, but are very happy to allow an increase in customs and excise. And you could see here in 1760, 800 items are liable to duty. By 1810, as a result of the Napoleonic Wars, we're now on 2,100 items. What's been taxed? Well, the items at the top, this is just a selection. You'll probably look and go, that's fancy taxes. Those are fancy taxes. But look when we get closer to the bottom, tobacco, whiskey, brandy, gin, wine, tea, coffee, chocolate, sugar, spices, salt. And this is a big problem here because, of course, there's no refrigerators. How do the poor make sure they've actually got meat and food to last through the winter? You need salt to preserve the food. And it's reckoned that the tax on salt is so high, 1/24 of a labourer's income is spent on paying the salt duty. Whereas for a person on 1,000 guineas a year, it's 1/100,000th of their income. Life is particularly unfair, and you can understand really why very much the poor, normal people embrace smuggling as a result of this tax regime. Is there a profit to be made? Oh, yes. Tea, you'll see, cheapest legal tea in shops, 7 shillings a pound, of which 5 shillings is government duty. You can smuggle tea in and still make a profit at 2 shillings a pound. And as you can see there, by 1780, 80% of the tea drunk in the UK is smuggled tea. The profits are greater on brandy and liquor. And you can see here, cheapest legal brandy, 32 shillings a gallon, 7 shillings is duty. Smugglers can buy undiluted, so you need to distill it, a gallon in France at 5 shillings and sell it at 25 shillings, which means that every gallon of basically brandy coming in, they're making £1 profit. Now, if I said to you that on the northwest Norfolk coast, on 2 beaches, every week the equivalent of 2,000 gallons of rum, brandy, and gin is being landed, and you're making a profit of £1 per gallon, and that's £1 profit, let's say, on 2,000, multiplied by 100 to give it its equivalent today, you've got a rough idea of the profits that can be made through smuggling. Of course, if there's that sort of profit, then big interests are involved in it. And one of the big interests, of course, is we refer to these as the directors of the free trade. Free trade equals smuggling. It's the City of London. There are syndicates operating in the City of London where you can take a share in a ship which is blatantly advertised as participating in the free trade, and you will get a cut. And it's worth your while doing so. The rates of profit are immense on this. And so many people in the City of London invest in smuggling syndicates. The second lot is the East India Company. So what's happening here? The East India Company, East Indiaman, there are 2 ledgers. One ledger is what you actually bring in from India and China. The revenue, the customs excise in London never see that ledger. The East Indiamen come into the Thames. They don't go into the Port of London. They wait in the Thames estuary. Boats are actually sent out. Goods are unloaded and then channeled through Kent and through Essex. The East India men then sail into London. They bring out the second ledger, which shows the goods that are left, and then present that to the customs and pay the customs duty on that second ledger. The customs officers in the customs house are simply bribed by the East India Company to sign off the second ledger. In 1763, 3 East India Company ships come out and actually travel from China, and they end up in the Fowey estuary in Cornwall. For 2 weeks, they are off the shore. People from all over Cornwall go and buy goods. We know this because the Lord Lieutenant writes to the government and say, nobody is getting their debts repaid in Cornwall because everybody has spent what money they have on actually buying these cheap goods from the East India Company ships. So this is a sort of thing that is going on. So at the very back, in the background, are directors of free trade. There's a local Mr. Big. Think of Jamaica in. So, Pengallan. Now, Mr. Big collects through his agent, the bagman. He's the person in control of the operation in the local area. We've got pictures of Mr. Big. This is Isaac Gulliver. He's Mr. Big in Dorset, particularly around Poole. He's known as the gentle smuggler because it was said of him, he was the only smuggler leader that never killed anybody personally. He let his men do it. But Gulliver organises the smuggling in the Poole area. The building on the right is Longborough House at Gruff-by-Sands in Cumbria. The reason I put an arrow there is it's a very nice Venetian window. Actually, you can't get into that right-hand window. It's in a separate room. That is where you signal that the coast is clear. So this is the sort of houses that people that are the Mr. Bigs can actually afford to buy and build off the profits of smuggling. Captains of the smuggling ships. What's very important is nobody is a smuggler full-time. When they're not smuggling, they're fishermen, they're pilots. They are basically your sailing expert. And this is a case in point. This is Jack Battenbury. For more than 40 years, smuggling and other maritime pursuits, well, that covers a host of sins, on the Dorset and Devon area. How do we know about him? He wrote his autobiography, and then somebody turned it into a very successful late Victorian book called The Rob Roy of the West. His speciality was smuggling French prisoners of war back to France. When he was actually captured doing so, he was acquitted by the jury that he bribed, because he turned around and said, my lord, he said, I didn't know they were French from France. I thought I was sending them to Jersey, and they speak French in Jersey, and he was acquitted. But this is the expert, the man who actually brings the goods over from France, from Holland, and then arranges with the landing party to take delivery. And this is for the smugglers a big problem. Do you get caught on the beach by the customs and excise? This is what you want to avoid. So what you're looking for, this is Cumberland, Robert Morden map. You want to land on a coastline which has not got many towns, and which has got lots of little inlets, and which has not got much habitation. And if you look at Cumbria, I'm just going to try and move the cursor down. Whitehaven in these days is the only part of the Cumberland coast with a revenue cutter. And if you know your sailing conditions in Cumbria, if you come out of Whitehaven, you're blown into the Solway Firth, which means you have a field day if you're wanting to land along the whole of this Cumberland coast and not be caught. When I was growing up, we used to go to Allenby. Let me just bring it back. Allenby is up from Whitehaven, up from Workington. It's there. And we go to Allenby. And I could never work out why there was a coastal road and then roads actually going from the coast at regular intervals, going to little villages. And the answer is really very clear. The roads are simply built on smugglers' tracks, because what you want to do is, once you've landed on Allenby Bay, is to get the goods as far away from the beach as you possibly can in as quick a time as you can. So this is where the landing party comes in. The landing party, who are they? Well, you're agricultural labourers. And, you know, people such as Arthur Young, the economist, will turn around and say, your average labourer is getting 16 pence in old money, so 1 shilling and 4 pence, if I can use phrases like that, a day working as agricultural labourer. But at night time, by being a member of the landing party, you get 2 shillings, sometimes 7 shillings, depending on what you do. And sometimes, if it's a big cargo, you'll get an extra guinea. Why wouldn't you be involved in this? The landing party gives phrases that come into the English language. Coast is clear, and the Attenboroughs of this world, when they get the signal, coast is clear, it's acknowledged by what is called a blue flash. These are words that come into the English language. These are the implements. I'm using a set of cigarette cards produced by Ogden in 1932 here. But these are words that come into the English language. These are the things that give the signal. The coast is clear. The person actually giving the signal, because there is a blue flash, gets called a flasher, would you believe? A person who's protecting the landing party with a very big club is called a batman. So when you get into the Victorian army and you know, oh, I've got my batman, well, actually, this is where this person comes from originally. And then what you do is you move the goods inwards. And I've just put a selection of places that we know. Ruins are great for smugglers. So they put them into Hurstmonceux Castle in Sussex. They put the next one down, Manorbier Castle in Wales. They put them into tombs. They put them into churches. This is Isaac Gulliver's Kinnan Churchyard and Kinnan Church, where he actually put stuff. But the place on the Solent, which is quite nice, this is Eaglehurst Tower. And Eaglehurst Tower is the home of Temple Simon Luttrell. He's a landowner and a very wealthy man. And this is for once where a tunnel actually leads from the beach into the folly that he builds there. And this is his actual way of getting smuggled goods onto his estate, because who's going to challenge him? What's he smuggling in? The finest branded. Who's his major customer? King George III. Needless to say, Luttrell is never prosecuted. Smuggling also leads to the creation of ghost stories. Many of the ghost stories that circulate are actually produced by smugglers. You want to terrorize the local populace so they don't go when you're on a run. This is a ghostly drummer of Hurstmonceux. He's actually a smuggler. They put him in old army garb and daub it with phosphorescence. And he walks around Hurstmonceux Castle beating a drum to the terrorization of the local inhabitants. Only, of course, when there's a smuggling run on. This is also a smuggling story, if you know what you're looking for. This is the culvert. The print is 1829, and it's a smuggling run. What is that cask doing on that pole? Obviously, the tide is out. When the tide comes in, it won't be actually affected by the seawater. It's, of course, a cask of spirits. Here you've got the culvert tower, which is used to give signals. But here is a windmill, stating the obvious. The millers are paid by the smugglers to actually communicate for them. If you have a windmill with its sails set across the St. Andrew, that means the revenue is on its way. If the coast is clear, there's no revenue in the area, the millers turn the sail to the cross of St. George. Now we know why nobody's picked up the cask of spirits, because this print is simply saying the revenue is on its way. A lot of work has been done on a particular company operating very close to Whitstable. This is by a work by a wonderful guy called Wallace Harvey on the Sea Salter Company. It's established by a most renowned and respected and loved physician of Ashford, Dr. Isaac Rutten. He purchases farms and churches for his sons, who keep an eye out for the revenue. And of course, he was going to challenge a clergyman. In 1792, the lease of this building, which is actually the parsonage at Sea Salter, is assigned to a gentleman called William Baldock, originally a poor boy employed to look after cows. Well, in 20 years later, This is William Baldock. He is the owner of Petham Hall. He's had it built. He's a JP, a ship owner, a brewery owner. His will in 1812 shows he is worth £1 million in those days' money. This is a bill of sale, you'll see. It's his wine collection. It will be delivered from the cellars of his late residence, number 3, Royal Crescent, Bath. Not bad for a poor boy who grew up looking after cows. That's what smuggling can do for you. What's the opposition? The riding officers. 300 of them to cover the whole coastline of England and Wales. Most of them are 60 years old. Most of them are paid £420 a year. The smugglers pay them more to look the other way. There are revenue cutters, but unfortunately, to cover the coastline of England and Wales, there are only 21 of those. Dragoons, yes. And a lot of people turn around and say, the dragoons don't get involved in trying to curb smuggling because, of course, they want to recruit from the area and this will make them unpopular. That is very unfair. Some pioneering work done very recently on Kent and Sussex shows that the dragoons are actually playing a really important role in trying to catch smugglers, as most certainly is the Royal Navy. And for the Royal Navy, there is, this is one from my collection, an armed King's cutter chasing a smuggler off Whitby. And the King's cutters are controlled by the customs, by the revenue. One of the problems, and I put this in mainly for Mr. Brunier in case he has an idea of setting up a private enterprise in Yorkshire, but one of the guys that is the main leader of smuggling in Yorkshire is a guy called George Fagg of Scarborough. And George Fagg has got a ship called the Kent, and he's got basically 16 4-pounder cannon and a dozen swivel guns on it. And in 1774, 2 revenue cutters try and take the Kent, they fail. And the only time that Fagg is actually caught is when, having given the revenue cutters a slip, he's spotted by 2 frigates of the Royal Navy and he's taken. And the Navy like taking smugglers, because if you are taken as a smuggler and you're prosecuted and successfully prosecuted, the choice is this: you're hung or we give you a chance to join the Royal Navy. And so the Royal Navy actually likes doing this because it gets experienced sailors. What happens is there some legacy of all of this? Well, this tombstone on the right hand side is again in Cumbria, bonus on Solway. It's a man, you may be able to make it out, from Ramsey in the Isle of Man. He's killed by the revenue when he's trying to smuggle stuff into Cumbria. Another thing that the authorities will do is actually cut a revenue boat in 2, and that can sometimes be used as a house, which you can see here, the prize. It forms a roof. And for those of you who may remember your David Copperfield, then this is Peggotty's house. Peggotty's house in David Copperfield is actually half a cut boat that had previously been used in smuggling. The authorities don't get it their own way. A violent gang, the Hunstanton gang in, let me just remove Chris, who's just arrived here. Chris, can you cut off your video, please, sir? Thank you. Hunstanton gang in the 1780s are landing major cargoes on the Norfolk coast. They put them into a church at Old Hunstanton. The revenue officers are tipped off, they seize the cargo. The guy who is in charge of the sort of sailing part of it, a guy called Francis Kimball, swears vengeance. They deliberately feed misinformation by a known informer to the authorities that there's going to be another landing. The dragoons and the excise officers ride down to the actual beach to seize the cargo. What they don't realise is that there's armed smugglers on both sides of the hedgeway. The armed smugglers open fire. As you can see here, this is a gravestone at the back of it. Private William Webb, 15th Light Dragoons, killed by smugglers in 1784. They also kill the excise officer. And the excise officer's a wife and 2 kids. The wife swears vengeance. They capture the ringleader here, Francis Kimball. They put him on trial at Bedford. He bribes the jury, he's acquitted. The authorities seize him again, take him to London and put him on trial. He's acquitted again. He bribes the London jury. And there is a real problem in getting people actually successfully prosecuted. Because you rely on informers, and you can see here, this is in a churchyard in Essex, a man, name unknown, who was found murdered on the morning of the 22nd of April, 1814, in this parish by his head being nearly severed from his body. That's what happens when you decide to inform on the smuggling fraternity. One of the biggest smuggling gangs and most notorious are the Hawkhurst gang. They terrorised the areas of Kent and Sussex between 1730 and 1750. They can say they can call out basically a posse, 500 men like that. And in the 1740s, they actually have some goods seized or put into a customs house, a pool in Dorset, and 80 armed members of the Hawkhurst gang ride from Sussex to Dorset to get their goods back. This the authorities can't stand. You can't have the social order being upset here. And so rewards go out. Some people turn informers. And there is a guy called Chater who turns an informer. And with a very old excise officer called Galley, they set off to give evidence. They are waylaid by the Hawkhurst gang. Galley is beaten and buried alive. Chater, as you can see here, cut him across his eyes and nose while he's saying the Lord's Prayer. He's then flogged to death with whips by 2 members of the gang. The authorities now have had enough, and troops come into Kent and Sussex. The Hawkhurst gang are arrested, and many are executed at Tyburn. And this is one, in a way, this is a seismic change in the smuggling world here. But the most important thing that would kill the smuggling in this first part of the story is Pitt's Commutation Act. Because the way of killing smuggling, of course, is to stop it being profitable. And in 1784, Pitt, having dealt with the implications of the American War of Independence, actually removes and reduces tax on tea, tobacco, and French wine. And at a moment, he's killed the great bulk of the smuggling industry in this country. In 1785, he gives them an example they will never forget. He marches troops into Deal, one of the main smuggling towns, and burns the fishing fleet. And he's still vilified today in Deal. But Deal, Pitt's Act here, sorts out smuggling, providing, of course, the government don't need any more money. But of course, as we all know, the Napoleonic Wars are on their way. And in the Napoleonic Wars, smugglers help both sides, because deals have to be struck here. Our friend Isaac Gulliver, the gentle smuggler, never actually killed anybody personally. This is his home, Kimpton Lodge. How does he figure? Gulliver is over in Boulogne doing some deals, and he picks up news that a French squadron is about to leave Brest, sail to Weymouth, and kidnap King George III on holiday. Gulliver, being a noble Englishman and a smuggler, decides to let the authorities know. The squadron is sent out of Portsmouth. It attacks the French squadron, which is forced back. And the king, being told about this, says, I would love to meet this noble Englishman. And the authorities turn around and say, but your majesty, you can't meet him, he's a smuggler. And the king says, I don't care, he says, he saved my life. Let him smuggle whatever he wants. In 1822, Isaac Gulliver is given a great funeral and buried as a freestanding member of the community in Wimborne Abbey in Dorset. Nelson will use pilots, therefore smugglers, for his raids on Boulogne and also Copenhagen. But the most strangest thing here is officially deals have to be done between us and Napoleonic France at the government level. During the Napoleonic Wars, we have a real problem with harvests. We need grain, France needs gold bullion. And from 1809 to 14, as you can see, a limited number of trade licenses are issued by the French and British governments, allowing us to get grain to feed the British people and allowing France to get gold bullion, which it badly needs. And of course, this allows a lot of people to develop this business. And this is what Napoleon said about the smugglers. And, you know, I received great help from being the smugglers. They're people who do anything for money. They bring over newspapers, dispatches, and spies. They take spies over to England. They land them. They keep them in their houses. They assist French prisoners to escape. And what he does is he establishes inbuilt communities for these smugglers at Rostov, at Dunkirk, but particularly Gravely. And if you want to know more about this, the work came out earlier this century by a guy called Gavin Daly of the University of Tasmania. It was so important that Cambridge University Press immediately published the article, and it was called Napoleon and the City of Smugglers, 1810 to 1814. And he concentrated particularly on Gravely. And what Gavin Daly did was, although we haven't any records of this in the UK, the French authorities most certainly do. And particularly in 1812, there exists reports which detail out this actual smuggling city at Gravely, which could take up to 300 English smugglers. It detailed what the arrival and departure procedures would be, what the housing and feeding of the smugglers should be, the lodgings they could actually have, and most importantly, the merchants licensed to import and export goods through the smugglers. And this actually allows us now to pinpoint, I'm not going to tell you who it is, one of the leading household names that is actually in the background of this very murky business. One of the things that they are running, obviously, they expand this thing, they exceed the deal done on how much gold bullion was actually going to give the French, and you can see the massive amount of golden guineas that are run by a small, select group of smugglers based out of Deal and Christchurch in Hampshire to France. Now, Britain has been on a paper currency since about 1797. So where are all these golden guineas coming from? The building is the Black House, Christchurch in Hampshire, which is the centre of the Christchurch group that are smuggling golden guineas. They take them over in very fast boats, galleys that can go very, very quickly. And if you read your O'Brien novels, this is actually referred to in one of the O'Brien novels. They're also taking over French prisoners of war. You can see here in 1811 alone, 140 French officers returned to France after breaking parole. Paul Chamberlain, in his wonderful books, will say the ordinary guys don't want to leave. They're getting such a good deal at Norman Cross. Officers is different. Officers do want to get back. And you can see the time scale that people will actually take. This guy escapes 10th of February, arrives on Deal on the 12th, is actually crossed to Gravely on the 16th of February. Now, smugglers to do this are covering the country. There's an example of a Deal smuggler who's arrested at Thame at Oxfordshire, which is a depot town, and he's arrested because when they search his wagon, he's got 3 French officers in the back. So it's worth a while for smugglers to actually get into central England to actually help French prisoners of war to escape. I owe a great deal of gratitude to Steve Wright on this one, who gave me a lot of the detail. This is Lejeune. Lejeune is a colonel, ADC, the Emperor. He's an expert in artillery and engineering. He's captured in the Peninsular War. The Spanish guerrillas realize it's important, they do kill him, and so he becomes part of the British prisoner of war setup in this country. They're not going to put him in Norman Cross, after all, he's a gentleman. So they put him at Ashby de la Zouch, and he is a whale of a time. His diaries are produced in the 1840s. And basically, he hunts, he flirts with the local girls, he gets invited to great dinners, and in 1811 gets tapped on the shoulder, the emperor wants you. And before long, he's actually escaping. And he documents in his story where he escaped from Ashby de la Zouch to Northampton, from Northampton by road to North London, from North London through London to Reigate, and then over to Folkestone. And you travel by day because that's when everybody else is using the roads. And then you actually get, put up overnight. So when I gave part of this talk to St. Albans about a month ago, I said, so which inn in St. Albans gives this guy bed and breakfast? Because somebody does. Lejeune's successful escape leads to a model for probably the most famous escape. And this, of course, is Lefebvre Desnouettes. Lefebvre Desnouettes captured at Benavente, Moor's retreat. Again, he's not going to go to Norman Cross. They put him in Cheltenham. And when it's brought out that Lejeune has escaped, Harris starts to think, can we pull the same flanker with Lefebvre Desnouettes? And they do. His wife is young and very beautiful. She is sent over, and they live the life of luxury in Cheltenham. They ride around in an open carriage. They're feted by everybody. They're the golden couple. Tap on the shoulder, the emperor wants you. And in 1812, early 1812, for obvious reasons for what comes next, Desnouettes, dressed as a Russian officer, speaking of French, because of course the Russian aristocracy do speak French, with his wife dressed as his son and his ADC dressed as his servant, leave Cheltenham in a carriage and make their escape. We even, thanks to Steve, know the hotel in Leicester Square in London that they stay in. This causes a stink of the first order. But the smuggler that smuggles them over is arrested, paroled, and we never hear anything more about him ever again. Lefebvre Desnouettes, of course, the reason why Napoleon wants him is who's going to command the light cavalry in a Russian campaign. Perhaps he might have thought he should have stayed at Cheltenham. What else are they smuggling over? Correspondence, personal letters, newspapers, the Naval Chronicle. Napoleon and Decrès, the Minister of War, actually say, we want this document, which is produced every 6 months, saying what the Royal Navy is doing. And that gets sent over to Gravelines as well. What do they bring back? This is the amount of stuff they bring back. And this is why everybody is in smuggling, because they're bringing over masses of lace and silk, what the aristocracy and the middle class want to buy. They are also paid, and this is important for who the Mr. Big is, in bills of exchange and French francs. So whoever you are as Mr. Big is going to have to be able to handle French francs and bills of exchange. Moving on. As the smugglers are growing, so are the opposition. After Trafalgar, one of the great things is that the cutters can now actually be deployed against smugglers. In 1809, a thing called a preventative water guard is set up, where actually there's better control and you pay people more. The riding officers get paid more so that they're not as susceptible to bribery by the smugglers. Because what is going to happen now with the end of the Napoleonic Wars is panic. The army is still, of course, there's an army of occupation in France. But for the Navy, the slashing in the Navy manpower causes Lord Commissioners for Treasury a major problem. Where are all these experienced sailors going to go? If we don't do something, then these sailors are going to actually become smugglers, and the thing will get worse. The smugglers get more sophisticated as well. And you can see here depictions of where they hide the actual barrels of contraband in false sides in the ship. And see the water cask. Well, the water's in the middle, but what's hidden in the sides? They also start to waterproof the barrels. And what the revenue do is, and you see this is from the Smuggling Museum at Hastings, they have this gigantic, well, this very, very large sort of, I don't know what it is really, an anchor. It's called a creeper. And you pull it along the seabed and pull up all this contraband that is waiting to be caught when the revenue is no longer in the area, when it's waiting to go through. What is really, really important is this lot. They decide in 1819 to set up what is called the coast blockade. And the coast blockade is made up of ex-Navy men. These people are paid a bounty. Let me just cut off Ryan's video who's arrived. They are paid a bounty per smuggler they capture. They are provided with the best firearms. They are provided with the experimental steam launches that the Navy are looking at. And this group called the Water Guard runs from Kent through to Hampshire. Their commander is the captain of the Royal Navy with a wonderful name of Flogging Joe McCulloch. And that says it all, really. They are very, very determined to deal with the smugglers. And this is another one for my collection here. Smugglers attempting to run a cargo intercepted by the actual coast blockade. And you've seen a Navy guy with the bicorn hat getting stuck in there to the actual smugglers. What is also important for the coastal blockade is where they are placed on land. This is where the Martello towers are used. I'm not so much interested in this one at Dymchurch. We follow it along past that modern flat roof building. There's another Martello tower. And of course, if you were positioned in all these Martello towers in short distance from each other, you can make life very, very difficult for people trying to land goods on the actual shore. Now, somebody has got their audio on, and it's not me, so if they could cut the audio, please, I would be obliged, so I can keep going for everybody else. A new organisation is set up based on the success of the coastal blockade to cover the coastline, firstly, of England and Wales, later of Ireland. And it is set up originally in 1823, but this is its actual operating instructions from 1829. It is, of course, the Coast Guard. And what I hope you'll pick up straight away is that Coast Guard has got nothing and no interest in saving mariners at sea or helping navigation. All officers and persons employed in the Coast Guard are to bear in mind that the sole object of our appointment is the protection of the revenue. And this is made nationwide. Just with the Hawkhurst gang, something else causes a trigger and a decline in smuggling. And this is the Aldington gang that are operating out of Kent. In 1821, there is what is called the Battle of Brookland on Romney Marsh. You can see there's a small number of blockade officers are killed and a small number of smugglers. The real truth is there's 100 people on either side fighting. And the leader, having got himself quite drunk beforehand, hands his pistol to one of he thinks his guys, and says, "Next revenue officer you see, blow his brains out." Unfortunately, the guy turns the pistol on the lead and says, "I am a revenue officer, you're nicked." Words to that effect. The guy is strung up. And a guy called George Ransley becomes the leader. In 1826, Ransley's gang shoot a blockade officer near the bathing machines at Dover. He's spotted as a landing. He doesn't fire at them. He simply puts his pistol and puts the shot up into the air to summon assistance. They shoot him. He's got a wife, he's got a couple of kids. And this is a time we're starting to get a growth in religion, a growth in morality. People are turning around and saying, this is unacceptable. And the government are very clever. They change the law. Instead of automatically stringing smugglers up, they send them to the wilderness. Yes, you guessed it. Transportation to Australia. And juries now, realizing they're not going to necessarily kill somebody, but transport them, are much more willing to convict. But the real thing that will kill smuggling is Peel. And Robert Peel simply turns round and says, you know what Pitt did in 1780? Why don't we do the same? And in his budget in 1842 and 1845, he will abolish the duty on over 600 commodities and reduce the tax on others. And this is a stroke, just like with Pitt, kills smuggling. There is a by thing here, a byproduct, because some of his cabinet aren't convinced this will actually work. And Peel says, well, I tell you what, we'll put a safety net in place. In case this doesn't work, and I fervently believe it will, that the other temporary tax that Pitt brought in, called income tax, will bring it back. And they bring it back. And they sell it on the basis this is a temporary tax. In the 1870s, Gladstone and Disraeli are still selling it to the British people. This is a temporary tax we only needed to cover exceptional expenditure. Well, you can guess it's been with us ever since. And Peel's budget works. In 1874, income tax is bringing in £7 million into the exchequer. The new tax on customs and excise, which everybody is now fully prepared to pay, is bringing in £47 million into the exchequer. Sir William Martin sent me an email. He said, found this tombstone of a guy who's a soldier, and he marries this French girl, and they come back and he becomes a publican. And he looks a very posh stone for a publican. I wonder if he's involved in actual smuggling. I laughed. I said, Willie, I said, every publican's involved in smuggling. And the reason is this. It's rather like that great Father Brown story, where Father Brown is walking with his best friend, you know, the French convict, and he says, where is the place? He asks the French convict, he says, where is a place to commit the perfect murder? And the answer, of course, is to murder someone on a battlefield during a battle. The perfect place to hide contraband goods is in a pub. Because how can you prove to the excise, prove to me that that is contraband and that isn't? Because your documents are forged anyway. And so publicans are the main depositories for alcohol that is brought in. Every publican in the UK benefits from it because they get it at a reduced price on which no tax has been paid. If you pay the tax, you become bankrupt. And also, as I put here, cheap brandy and gin via Essex and London, lace for the missus, totally legit gov, and this is how stuff is done. Everybody benefits from smuggling. Smuggling, the byproduct, is in every town in the UK. Something to help for Gareth here. Smugglers may have brought in the first news of Battle of Waterloo. As you can see here, the first and fullest account was brought by Mr. Sutton, a gentleman of Colchester. The newspaper is dated June the 21st. That's, of course, when the news comes to St. James's, but it relates to yesterday morning. So this news comes in on the 20th of June. Mr. Sutton, a gentleman of Colchester, whom we understand to be the proprietor of a passage vessel sailing between that place and Ostend, and blah, 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 the principal information we are still indebted to Mr. Sutton. Yes. The passenger boats from Ostend to Colchester are some of the biggest traffickers of smuggling. And we now know from research done in Essex that Sutton is one of the biggest smugglers in Essex. So the news of Waterloo is brought in by smugglers. That's what I'm going to perhaps leave you as the tantalizing question. There's no need for books to be written on smuggling. In case you thought, let's write a book. Richard Platt has written one called Smuggling in the British Isles, but his best book is the one in the middle, in my opinion. The Ordnance Survey Guide to Smugglers' Britain. Imagine you've got the Ordnance Survey maps for all the areas of the British coast, and they pinpointed the areas where smuggling is known to have occurred. And in that book, Platt tells the stories. Geoffrey Morley's book, The Smuggling War, Platt's book tells it from the smuggler's point of view. Morley's book tells it from the revenue point of view. If you get both, that sort of gives you the main story. My final slide. Of course, when Peel removes the taxes, that doesn't stop taxes on goods being reapplied. And in the 1890s, tax on tobacco, revenue duty on tobacco is raised. And it becomes fashionable again to smuggle cigars in. And this guy is the original bootlegger, because in his waders are cigars, but he's actually smuggled into the UK. Now, remember, Ogden cigarette cards from 1932, so there you are, the ultra-modern smuggler. But smuggling today, of course, bears some resemblances to smuggling in the 18th century. There is massive profit to be made. And of course, let me stop share screening. There we go. There is massive profit to be made. And of course, providing you can actually get the goods or the people away from the coastline where you land them and get them into London, where you can hide them in the great metropolis, it's very much what the smuggling in the 18th century actually did. Thank you very much for listening. Very happy to take any questions on chat, please.